I cannot do this anymore. I know everything you did. The wedding is over.
260 guests stood in a half circle around a dance floor built from hay bales and string lights, waiting for a song that never played. My name is Mara Whitfield, and 40 minutes before that silence, I handed a flash drive to a DJ named Marcus and asked him to trust me one more time. He didn't ask why. That's the end of it. It actually starts 3 nights earlier, in my own kitchen, with a phone call that never technically hung up. I had known Piper Nash since we were 7 years old, since a rain-soaked recess period when her umbrella broke, and I gave her half of mine without being asked. We got matching compass tattoos on the inside of our wrists the summer we turned 18, 2 small blue needles pointing at nothing in particular, because we used to promise each other that no matter where life scattered us, we'd always find our way back. She'd built a floral design business out of the bed of her father's pickup truck, into the only name anyone in Millhaven trusted with a wedding, and for 6 years, more than half of those weddings had taken place at Sutter Orchard, the cider farm that had belonged to my fiancé's family for 3 generations. That was how Piper knew Grant first. That was how I met him at all, 2 Octobers ago, at a bonfire after somebody else's wedding, when Piper grabbed my sleeve and pulled me across the grass to introduce us. For 2 years, I told that story like it was proof of how much she loved me. I didn't yet understand it was also a confession, just one I wouldn't learn to translate for a long time. Grant and I had been together 2 years, engaged for the last 13 months of it. Piper was my maid of honor and my florist both, which meant she'd been in the room for nearly every fitting, every tasting, every late-night argument about seating charts. And I had never once thought to count how many other hours she spent alone with him outside of it. I thought of it as a gift. Some brides have to hire a planner. I had a best friend who already loved everyone at the center of the whole thing. 3 nights before the wedding, Grant told me he was staying at the orchard's greenhouse to help Piper load the last of the eucalyptus and ranunculus into her van for the centerpieces, which was an entirely unremarkable thing to hear. Something the 2 of them had done 100 times before without my thinking twice. He called at 9:14, the way he had most nights that week, said maybe 4 words, then told someone else in the room to hold on a second. And then nothing. Just a low murmur and the particular kind of silence that comes from a call that was never actually ended. I did not hang up. I want to be honest about that part, because it's the one I've turned over the most since. Some instinct colder than curiosity kept that phone pressed to my ear, while I listened to a conversation I was never meant to hear, between the 2 people I trusted before anyone else on earth. I heard Piper's voice before I made out the words, because I would know that voice underwater, in a crowded room, in my sleep. She was saying she didn't know how she was supposed to stand at that altar tomorrow and hand me my own flowers. He was saying he just needed to get through tomorrow, and then they'd figure out what happened after. Not if. What? As if the wedding itself was only an inconvenient formality standing between the life he'd planned with me and whatever he intended to keep doing with her. I didn't drop the phone. I didn't scream into a pillow the way people do in movies. I sat at my kitchen table with a stranger's name half-finished in calligraphy ink on the escort card in front of me, and I listened to the recording again after it saved itself to my voicemail, and then a 3rd time, not because I doubted what I'd heard, but because some small, stupid, hopeful part of me needed it to sound different by the 4th listen. It never did. Once I stopped listening for a different ending, I started listening for a beginning, and that was worse. I thought about every Thursday Grant stayed late at the cidery. I thought about the anniversary dinner he'd missed for a vendor emergency that Piper had also, coincidentally, needed help with that same night. I thought about how she was always available the moment he needed her, and how I'd spent 18 months feeling grateful for it. That, in the end, was the part that took longest to grieve. Not the affair itself. The gratitude. I called my twin brother, Jonah, a little past midnight. He wanted to cancel everything right then, wanted to drive to both of their apartments and burn the whole thing down before sunrise. I told him no. I had spent 2 years letting other people decide what my own life would look like, and I wasn't about to let someone else write the ending of this chapter too. I wanted to choose the moment. I wanted to choose the room. Jonah didn't understand that logic that night. He helped me anyway, because that's what twins do, and because he had never once in 29 years told me no when I asked him for something that actually mattered. The next 2 days were a performance convincing enough to frighten me. Piper called about the flower delivery, and I told her the arrangements sounded perfect. Grant called the night before the wedding to say he couldn't believe tomorrow was finally here, that he loved me, that he'd see me at the end of the aisle, and I told him I loved him too, and hated how easily it came out. How much practice it apparently takes to lie convincingly to someone, and how I had clearly already had that practice without ever knowing it. Reverend Purnell, who'd known both our families since before Jonah and I were born, pulled me aside at rehearsal and told me a marriage isn't tested in its big moments, but in its small, quiet ones over years. I remember thinking mine had already been tested and had already failed 3 nights before it had even technically begun. The morning of the wedding, Piper did my hair the way she had every important morning of my life since we were 14, humming under her breath, telling me how lucky she felt to have been part of every single piece of this. She meant it. That was the actual horror of the whole thing. She wasn't lying about loving being part of my wedding. She had simply also been sleeping with my fiancé for the better part of a year, and had never once let those two facts interfere with each other, which meant that somewhere inside her, they weren't actually in conflict at all. The ceremony itself I remember only in pieces, the way you remember a room you once walked through with a fever. It was held under the oldest apple tree on the Sutter property, older than Grant's own grandfather, its branches strung with the same small white lights that would later hang over the reception. Reverend Purnell said the words he'd said at 100 other weddings. Grant said his vows in a voice that didn't shake once, which I've thought about more than almost anything else since. I said mine in a voice that didn't shake either, and for 11 minutes, standing under a tree 3 generations old, reciting promises I no longer believed applied to either of us the same way I was, on paper, somebody's wife. The reception moved into the old hay barn as the sun went down, string lights strung wall to wall, a tower of cider donuts stacked by the door, 260 guests who loved us both settling into folding chairs at long farm tables. Jonah gave a toast that made people laugh and made our aunts cry, and the whole time his eyes kept finding mine across the room, the way you check a clock when you already know exactly what time it is. Marcus stood at his booth near the dance floor with a flash drive in his shirt pocket I'd handed him 40 minutes earlier, and he'd asked me exactly one question before agreeing to any of it. He asked if I was sure. I told him I had never been more sure of anything in my life, and for the first time in 3 days, that was the complete truth. At 8:40, Marcus dimmed the barn lights for the first dance. 260 people turned toward the center of the floor, the way a room does when it expects to watch something beautiful. Grant took my hands. I let him. Marcus leaned into the microphone and announced, in the easy voice of a man who's done this 100 times, that this next song was for the happy couple, and then he played the file I'd given him instead of the song we'd picked out 4 months earlier. For a few seconds, nobody understood what they were hearing. Then Piper's voice filled the barn, asking how she was supposed to stand at that altar tomorrow. Then Grant's voice, telling her he just needed to get through the wedding, and they'd figure out what happened after. Not if. What? The recording ran 7 minutes, and I let every second of it play, standing in the middle of that floor in my wedding dress with my hands still loosely inside my husband of 4 hours, watching 260 faces change in real time, watching the exact moment each of them understood. Piper was on her feet near the head table, a champagne glass slipping out of her hand and shattering against the barn's plank floor. Grant's face had gone the color of the tablecloths, his fingers slack around mine. I was the only person in that barn who wasn't surprised, which meant I was the only one still capable of speaking. I told him our first dance should be an honest one, since almost nothing else that year had been, and then I stepped back and let the room have whatever was left of it. It was Piper who broke first, the way I somehow knew she would, mascara running as she screamed across the barn that he'd promised her he would end things with me before the wedding. That she'd begged him for months to just tell me the truth himself instead of making her carry it. Grant spun toward her and called it a mistake, called her unstable, said things I won't bother repeating because I don't believe he believed a single one of them even as he said them. Watching the two of them turn on each other in front of everyone who loved us both was the moment the barn stopped murmuring and started simply staring, in that particular silence of 260 people realizing exactly what they'd shown up for. Nobody clapped. What happened instead was quieter and somehow worse for both of them. People started to stand, one table at a time, my coworkers first, then our aunts, then Grant's own uncle, setting their gift envelopes back down on the table by the door on their way out, like the only thing left worth saying was nothing at all. Jonah crossed the floor and took my hand before I even had to ask. We walked out through the barn doors together into the cold, past 260 untouched slices of cake, and left Grant and Piper alone in a room built for a celebration, still shouting at each other over the sound of Marcus quietly packing up his gear. I changed out of my dress in a gas station bathroom 40 minutes outside Millhaven, folded it into a garbage bag, and dropped it in a donation bin outside a thrift store the following week. I quit my job at the landscape architecture firm a month later, partly because half our contracts ran through Sutter Orchard, and I couldn't look at another set of site plans for that land. I blocked both their numbers before I left the state, and learned slowly that forgiveness was never actually the price of moving on, no matter how many people insist otherwise. Whatever word reached me after that came unasked for, the way it always does in a small town. Grant and Piper tried, for a few months, to build something honest out of what they'd wrecked to get there, and couldn't survive a single dinner without turning on each other, over whose fault it truly was. The orchard lost half its wedding bookings within the year, once the story made its way around the county the way stories do. Piper's floral business folded before the following spring. None of it gave me anything close to satisfaction. It only confirmed, quietly, that I'd already left all of it a long way behind me. I moved to Asheville with 2 suitcases and no plan beyond distance. I rented the small cottage behind a larger house on a wooded lot, owned by a furniture maker named Theo Marsh, and I noticed him for 2 full weeks before we ever actually spoke, mostly through the sound of a table saw drifting up from his workshop some evenings. A storm took down a birch limb across my narrow driveway the week I moved in, and I woke before dawn to a chainsaw, and found it already cleared by the time I opened my door, a note tucked under a rock that read sorry about the noise, in handwriting that looked like it belonged to someone who built things for a living. He brought coffee that afternoon as a proper apology, and for weeks after that we were nothing more than 2 people who nodded in the driveway and occasionally agreed that Asheville never seemed to run out of rain. He never once asked why a woman my age had moved across the country alone with 2 suitcases, never pushed for a single detail I wasn't ready to give, and it was that patience, more than anything else, that eventually got me to sit on the porch of his workshop one October evening, surrounded by sawdust and the half-built frame of somebody's dining table, and tell him a small piece of why I'd come. He listened without once trying to fix it, and when I finished, he told me that anyone who truly loves you doesn't need an audience to prove it, only you. It was such a plain, unremarkable thing to say that it landed harder than almost anything anyone had told me in the 2 years before it. 2 years after a barn full of guests watched my first marriage end, before the cake was ever cut, Theo walked me to the back corner of his land, where he'd spent that whole time quietly nursing 3 young apple trees that still didn't reach my shoulder, and asked whether I wanted to spend the rest of my life planting things slowly beside him. There was no barn. There was no orchard 3 generations deep, no string lights, no flash drive tucked into anyone's pocket. I said yes before he even finished the question. We married the following fall among those same 3 trees, 18 people on mismatched chairs Theo had built with his own hands, Jonah standing beside me the way he has in every version of my life that's mattered. I wore a plain ivory dress with no train and carried flowers Theo had grown himself instead of anything bought for the occasion. Watching those 3 small trees sway while I said my vows, I understood something I don't think Grant or Piper ever will. Love that's real doesn't need 260 witnesses to make it true. It only needs one person willing to stay in the room after everyone else has gone home. People ask me sometimes whether I regret it, handing Marcus that flash drive instead of quietly calling the wedding off myself and disappearing before anyone had to know why. I always tell them the same thing. I could have spared Grant and Piper that barn, that recording, that whole ugly scene, and let them go on believing they'd gotten away with something clean. I didn't spare them, and I'd make the same choice again. The hardest thing I learned that year wasn't that people who love you can still betray you. It's that staying quiet to protect someone else's comfort was never the same thing as loving them. It was only ever fear wearing a nicer word. If you made it this far, thank you for staying with me through all of it. And if stories like this one, about the quiet ways people betray each other and the loud ways the truth eventually finds its way out anyway, are the kind of thing you come back for, stay close.